And the value that we are discussing this month is accountability. Now, what is accountability? Accountability is defined by Merriam-Webster as obliged to account for one's acts. Obliged to account for one's acts, responsible, capable of being accounted for, explainable. Now, when most of us think about the word accountable, we think about probably situations where we were held accountable for something and it ended up being a situation of blame and shame, or one of the two. But, it was like when we had to confess to something. I remember confessing to writing on the wall, or actually on the stall of a girl's bathroom. I think I was in the 3rd grade. And there was a lot of writing, and I just wrote, I hate Becky, because she was mean to me. and so then they said in the classroom, all right, who's been writing on the wall? And I stood up, because I was accountable. I stood up and I said, I did. I was the only one who stood up. I was the only one who, confessed. And so I didn't get to go to the library. I had to spend the afternoon washing down the bathroom walls. But Sally Bertolucci came with me because she felt bad, because she didn't want to confess to it, but she felt bad that I was confessing to it, and I think she probably did it too. So anyway, so when you think of accountability or responsibility, sometimes that's what comes to us, is those experiences that we had where it was all about blame and shame and, something I did. When I was on the plane, I watched a series from HBO about Warren Buffett. And he talked about, accountability, being accountable, that he buys these different companies, but he tells the company, I'm going to let you run your own company. I'm going to purchase this stock, and I'm going to be the, prime owner, but I'm not going to change anything. But what I want you to do is to run your business in a way that whatever comes out in the paper about your business is something you would want your whole family to know. You want them to know the good things. You don't want to be, held up as someone who's been cheating, lying, stealing, all of those things. You want to be held in esteem by your family and your friends. So run your business that way. That you want to be in integrity. You want to be accountable for your actions. Now, the purpose of finding out that something went wrong is really to fix it. What is it that makes us do things that we are held accountable for? Well, sometimes it's the way the system is organized that makes people do things that they shouldn't do, like that old Wells Fargo scandal where they were, opening accounts for people. They were getting credit for opening accounts, and they were opening accounts for people who didn't know they were having accounts opened for them. Because the people said, well, I need to make more money because banks are not famous for paying well, and so they started doing things illegally. The system was set up that way. So we look for what's wrong in the system. When there is a medical mistake, they get together and they try to figure out what is the problem here. How did this happen? Because their goal is to prevent it from ever happening again and finding out if it is a systemic problem. For instance, there was a thing where the medication said, 3 cc's. The problem was the cc's looked like zeros. So when you find out what's wrong, you can fix it. But you can't find out what's wrong if nobody will tell you what's going wrong. So we have to be accountable. We have to say what happened to the best of our knowledge and work with others to try to see how we can bring ourselves into a greater experience of excellence, of living from that place of integrity. Now, I recently had a conversation with someone, and they said, well, the devil, Satan is really acting up right now. Satan is really on the move. We've all got to be on guard. Satan is on the move. Well, the first thing I thought about was Flip Wilson. The devil made me do it. Do you remember Flip Wilson? He was a comedian. He always said, the devil made me do it. Whenever you did something wrong, the devil made me do it. Well, in this philosophy, we don't believe in the devil. We believe there is one power. Now, that power, we can choose how we're going to use that power. Are we going to use it creatively? Are we going to use it destructively? Are we going to use it to make our lives and everyone else's life better, or are we going to use it to aggrandize ourselves at the expense of others? We get to choose. And, Ernest Holmes says all these people who are doing these things that are harmful to one another do it out of ignorance. They're ignorant of the oneness, the fact that we are all interconnected. I mean, modern physics tells us this. Quantum physics tells us we are all connected. Now, people who do these terrible things don't realize that they're connected to all of these people. And, the infamous, what goes around comes around. Sometimes we are upset with the length of time it takes to come around. Sometimes we don't even get to see it come around. But we know that things in the universe do work in spirals, in circles. And so this is happening. Whoever is doing these things that we call evil, and there are people who are doing terrible things to one another in the world, we just have to know that in the midst of all of that, there is good as well. There are good people trying to do good things. I love that scene in Cold Mountain, which was a movie about the Civil War, where Renee Zellweger says, they call this war a cloud over the land, but they made the weather, and then they stand there in the rain and say, bleep, it's raining. I won't say the bleep. But they say, we create these wars, we create these acts of violence against one another, and then we say, oh, isn't it terrible? I recently went to see Wonder Woman, which I enjoyed thoroughly, I have to say. But she believed that by killing Ares, the god of war, that she would end war on the planet. And so they do have this horrific battle, and she, I won't tell you what happens, but of course she thinks that, war is going to end. But the problem is that human beings have both war and peace within them. That they've got that within them, and so the war does not come to an end. When I was in Scotland, every little village has some kind of memorial for the Great War, World War I. That was supposed to be the war that ended all wars, and of course it wiped out a generation of those in Great Britain. A whole generation of young men was lost in that war. And so every single village has some kind of memorial saying this was the war to end all wars. And yet it wasn't. The wars continue. And now they seem to be continuing continuously. So where do we start to shift our consciousness away from war as a solution? How do we do that? Well, we have to start with ourselves. Everything begins in consciousness, begins with our own thoughts. Who are we at war with? Where is our consciousness of warring against something? Now, this does not mean that we let people run roughshod over us. It means that we take a stand when we feel that it is something that we cannot not do. In other words, where we're guided by something to enable us to do something about a situation, and we are accountable to ourselves to take action on it. So yesterday on This American Life, they had a story of this guy, Doug Williams, who spent 10 years as a polygraph expert for the police department. So he ran lie detector tests all the time. And then he discovered that he could train people to fake out the machine, that it wasn't as infallible as people thought it was. And so he realized that there were a lot of polygraph experts out there helping businesses, and so they would charge them $250 a pop to run these tests, and they would just keep running them because it was income for them. And so they didn't care if the people were just nervous and didn't pass the test. And he just thought, these people are just out there ripping people off. This is not right. So he quit the police department. He had a truck, and he got a camper on the back of it, and he put in a potty and a shower. I don't know what he did, but anyway, he lived in his truck. And he started going around the country, speaking at churches and union halls and wherever he could find some space that people wanted to hear about it. And he told them, this polygraph stuff is baloney. These lie detector tests are not valid and should be abolished. And I can show you how to beat them if you want to know. And so he would train the whole group. This is how you beat a polygraph test. And he actually ended up testifying before Congress because they were looking at a bill to ban private companies from using polygraphs to vet employees. And so he testified and said, I was a right-wing terrorist because I was running this machine that would terrify people. Just the thought of it was terrifying people. And just the act of doing it was making people so nervous that they would flunk the test. And then they wouldn't get the job. And he said, it isn't right. This isn't right that this should be happening. And so he kept going on his crusade. And then he got into just doing training classes for people. He got, he actually ended up in jail at one point because he talked to somebody, and it was actually a sting operation to get him. But they did actually pass that law. They passed the law, the federal government passed the law that a private company cannot use a polygraph to vet an employee. But the government can, the FBI, the CIA, all of those agencies still use polygraphs. So he was helping government employees to pass the polygraph test and ended up in jail for 2 years. But he still has his crusade because he doesn't believe that the technology was invented in 1922. It measures heart rate, it measures the amount of moisture on your palms, things like that. He just showed people how to use visualization to overcome the questions. He was called to do that. And he carried it through because he was accountable to do what he knew to be right. And the thing is, when you get that call, sometimes it doesn't make sense to other people. Leave a good job. Go live in your truck. Stand in front of a tank and hold up your hand in Tiananmen Square. Makes no logical sense, but you're called to do it because it's the right thing to do and it inspires others. And maybe you took a fall for that, but that picture inspires others. There was a TED Talk this week by a man named Raj Panjabi. And Raj Panjabi was born in Liberia of Indian parents who had immigrated there. And he spent his childhood there, and then one day they were having a civil war there, and his mom said, "Pack up your stuff, we got to get out of here." And so he ended up in the United States, and he ended up becoming a doctor. But he went back to work in Liberia, and he saw situations where so many people have no health care, and they're dying from preventable things. He saw this woman who had her son come down with a fever and he had malaria. She had to walk for 2 days through the jungle to bring him to the hospital. And by the time she got there, he had passed. And the doctor there, Raj, said, "This is not right. We have to do something about this." So what he did was, he started finding women and men in the villages that were willing to be trained to do various medical procedures and to diagnose certain things and to give the appropriate medications. And so he formed an organization called The Last Mile. Let me verify that. Yeah, Last Mile Health. So he trains people, men and women to do various tests. One of the tests involved like a little band that has yellow, it has white, yellow, green, yellow, red, just like a traffic sign. And you put it around the arm of a child, and you can tell whether they have to go to the hospital or not because they're so malnourished. So they have all these little tips and tricks that they can do. And so he talked about this one kid. They put the thing around him. It was in the red. The guy there said, "Okay, this kid needs to go to the hospital." So he puts him in a boat, and he rows for several hours to the hospital, gets the kid in the hospital, and the kid is saved. Because he was there, and he had a boat. And this organization provided the boat. They provide the medical supplies, and they provide a salary for this person. Because they had set up, he started this in 2007, because they set up so many of these community health care workers in Liberia, they were able to catch and stop the Ebola from spreading in Liberia. Remember that Ebola outbreak we had a couple of years ago? It spread through many, many countries, but not through Liberia because they had all of these healthcare workers. What he's trying to do now, and he just won a TED Prize for this, is to set up a community health academy. I know you probably have heard of the Khan Academy, where you can look online and get all kinds of classes and education about all different kinds of subjects. Well, he is setting up a community health academy so that people can learn how to treat one another, how to get certified to be a community health care worker, and to become part of this network that actually helps people especially in developing countries, avoid having to die for preventable things. Now, he didn't have to do that. He was a doctor here in the USA. He could have just, bought himself a Tesla and a condo with a view of the city, and just, hung out. But he felt compelled to go back to Liberia and to see what he could do to help. And now he's not content to help just Liberia. He wants to help all of the developing world. And, I have to admit, the US of A is looking more like the developing world in many aspects. So we need to, make sure that people here have adequate access to health care as well. This is about being accountable to ourselves, accountable to our families, accountable to our communities, and accountable to being our presence in the world. For taking a realizing that our thoughts are absolutely telling us a story, and we have to understand what the story is that we're telling ourselves. And are we telling ourselves a story of our capabilities and our empowerment possibilities to move forward in the world, to be a benevolent presence, to be a presence for good? In the Science of Mind magazine this month, Dr. Petra Weldes says, she talks about taking responsibility and that this is part of spiritual maturity. When you first come into the Science of Mind, you think, okay, it's all about me getting what I need. I want my car, I want my relationship, I want my whatever. It's all about getting what we want. But what we find is we have to deal with the law of cause and effect. Everything we set in motion has an effect, and we have to take responsibility for the effect that it has. Now, sometimes that effect shows up in a way we didn't anticipate. The Reverend Dr. Peggy Bassett was a very famous minister back in the 80s and 90s. She started out in the 70s. She had been a waitress, and she became a minister. And she became a minister in the Huntington Beach Church. And she took that church from 40 people to 6,000 people. And she got ALS. So for 7 years, she was battling ALS. And people said, and this is not a question you should ask anybody, what were you thinking? Why did you get this disease? This is not the question we ever ask anybody. First of all, we're not the only ones thinking. We are stuck and mired in a collective consciousness that is pretty destructive in many ways. And so our job is to be conscious, because if we're not conscious, and we all slip out of it, but if we're not conscious, we get sucked into the collective consciousness which says, you're too old for that, or you're a woman, you can't do that, or you're African American, you can't do that, or you're a Mexican American, you can't do that. We get stuck in these stereotypes and beliefs that have nothing to do with reality, or a story we're telling ourselves. You tell your story and you say, I'm a survivor. You know what you say when you say I'm a survivor? You get a lot of things to survive. So it's really about, what story am I telling myself about who I am and what my life is about? So Dr. Petra says, show up the way you want to show up, no matter how anyone else is behaving. Give up your right to be reactionary and your need for drama. When we talk about responsibility, what we're talking about is the ability to respond rather than react. Somebody does something and we want to react. But if we can take a breath, what we can do is respond. And responding means we're centered in something that is larger than the situation. breathing it in. Respiration. We are respiriting ourselves when we take that breath and respond rather than react. Stop telling the story of what happened to you to new people in your life. Stop telling the story of what happened to you to new people in your life. I remember going through a ritual at a women's retreat that I went to where I let go of my story, like physically had, written it all out and then threw it into the fire and said, I am so done with telling that story. I'm so done with seeking people's sympathy, wanting people to put up with my bad behavior because I had this happen to me, so I should be able to get away with this. No. Start telling the story of how you are moving through your life from a spiritually grounded place. Start telling that story. That I know that there is something here that I can count on, that is always available, and that if I will let it, will guide and direct me. There's that great quote from Matthew, ask and it shall be given you, seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. But we have to knock. We have to seek. We have to ask for what it is we want. Fourth thing, be a benevolent presence in any group or situation and take responsibility for communicating responsibly. Communicating responsibly. Not from a place of judgment, not from a place of attacking, not from a place of war, but a place of standing in what you believe to be true and being willing to listen to someone else's truth and somehow finding a truth. Heard an interview with some guy, and he had been interviewed by Glenn Beck, and he said they first talked about their families, and they got to connect on the level of what they had in common before they went into the discussion of how they were different. So they carried on the difficult part of the situation, the difficult part of the conversation, from a place of having connected with each other at a human level, and so they could communicate with each other respectfully. Knowing and appreciating each other's responsibilities to family, and knowing that we have these areas of oneness. The last thing is, let others take responsibility for their choices, actions, and words. Let others take responsibility for their choices, actions, and words. Stop being responsible for everyone and everything. Stop being responsible for everyone and everything. And this is a hard one, especially with kids. You want your kids to, to do the right thing. And of course, we know what the right thing is. But just like we had to learn sometimes the hard way, sometimes they have to learn the hard way. And we can't protect them from life. So we each hold the key to our thoughts, our actions, and our reactions. And we can change our minds. We have that power. We can change our minds, focus on the good, be a presence for good wherever we are. So our affirmation for today is, I am willing to change my mind. 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 And so it is.